Hey everybody, it's Tommy Canelli and welcome back to Before the Lights podcast, the show that tells you how they made their mark. He's appeared as an invited guest panelist on several forums, a best-selling author, a professor of criminal justice at the Citadel, a former Philadelphia police officer, consultant for Black Brothers Inc. episode on the series of American Gangster. His writings include police legitimacy, securities fraud, professional sports gambling, organized crime, and more. Please welcome to the show, Sean Patrick Griffin. Sean, welcome to Before the Lights.
Thanks for having me, Tommy.
I'll let you pick who, what, how molded who you are today.
Oh my goodness, I could do more than an hour on that alone. I've been lucky. I had two great parents who were very supportive and valued education, even though I grew up working class or welfare class. They came from welfare class. I grew up working class in Philadelphia. My father was a police officer. My parents worked multiple jobs my entire childhood, so work ethic was not a problem in my family. So that's really how it started. But then I was very lucky because even though I went through the Philadelphia public school system, at least back then, you could find great teachers. Especially if, in my case, I had great English teachers and they were so supportive. It was unbelievable. And for whatever reason, they thought that I had a talent with writing and they supported me. That's especially true in high school, where unbeknownst to me, one of my high school teachers in high school in English submitted one of my essays for a national writing contest. And I think I placed third. It was something like that. It was a national writing contest. So I got invited to the White House, and it was a big deal. And of course, you know, for a young kid, it was very helpful with regard to giving you self-confidence that, wow, okay, I think I'm okay, but you don't know. Mm-hmm. That was in high school. And then when I went to college, I was a typical college student. I was thrilled I was even going to college, if you knew my background. And I had a mentor who I had as a professor, I think it was my sophomore year. And it's actually hard to say on a podcast. He cursed me out one day. He pulled me aside after a class one day and he was upset. He thought that I had way more talent than I was showing. He himself was a very prominent author. And he said, well, I won't give you the expletive version, but you know, what are you doing? You know, you have talent here. And look, I was happy to be writing, but how would you know? Everyone wants to be an author. Like everyone wants to be an author. Everyone wants to be whatever. And that conversation was just like my teachers in high school, who, by the way, I actually stayed friends with them way, way after high school because I was very lucky. I had a great relationship with them and they really mentored me straight through college. And then even when I graduated college, we were, you know, this is before email. So we were sending letters to each other back and forth. It was amazing. I was very lucky that I had people who were willing to help me and support me. And so when I was an undergraduate, I had that same exact experience. But if you had my college buddies on this phone call right now, or this interview, whatever you call it, they would tell you that we had a fateful conversation when we were graduating. And we all got around a table and we said, okay, what do you want to be doing in 5 years or 10 years? And at the time, I knew that I was going to be a Philadelphia police officer, but that was really a way to pay off college loans. That wasn't a goal. Okay. My father was a Philadelphia police officer. My brother was a Philadelphia police officer. And it was a fine life, but my father was very desirous of me to do something else. His argument was, hey, look, this is a great way of life. If you do that, that's fine. But I think you've got more opportunities than I had. So you do what you like. So at that table, they'll tell you, I said, well, look, in a perfect world, I would love to be a professor someday. But you have to understand my background. To me, that was just such fantasy land. There was no way that was never going to happen, let alone become an author. So it was literally a pipe dream. And then I went into the Philadelphia Police Department, had a great experience there. But while I was going there, I was also going to graduate school. And I was lucky because, again, in school, I had mentors who said, hey, look, we sure that you're enjoying this law enforcement career? Because at the time, I really assumed that I would spend a few years or however many years I needed to get into the FBI. That was really my goal at that point in time. And one of the people at Penn State where I was doing my work said, hey, look, while you're doing all that cops and robbers stuff, you said to us offhand one day that you'd love to be a professor and an author. That's not going to train you to be a researcher and a scholar. And I thought that was crazy because my whole, again, I don't come from a background in this. So I thought, what are you talking about? This is going to be great. I'll have Philadelphia police experience, like big metropolitan police department, and then I'll have FBI experience. It would make for a great academic career in 20 years or 30 years. And their argument was, yeah, but while you're doing that, your competitors are doing research, getting grants and doing all the sorts of things for decades. You'll never be able to crack into that. Well, for somebody like me, I didn't even understand what they were talking about. What do you mean grants and tenure and publications? I didn't know that world. And so early on in my Philadelphia policing career, I realized I had to make a decision. I was either going to go into federal law enforcement like I originally intended, or I'd have to make the switch into academia. And I was lucky. I keep saying this all the time. I'm lucky. I actually get now to speak to like high school students and college students and give mentoring advice or whatever. And part of the reason, if people follow me on Twitter or whatever, I routinely entertain conversations with high school students and college students because I was lucky. I had people trying to help me from the time I was like 12 or 13 years old. And I want to be that person for somebody else because I had this cocoon of people who literally helped me straight through young adulthood. They actually became editors, not formal editors, of course. But when I was writing my first couple of books, if you look at people who were sending me the written up, marked up versions, it's people literally going back to high school. They saw something in me and were willing to help me. So I always try and pay it back. So that's my 5-minute answer to your question. I've been lucky. I've had so many people throughout my life who said, for whatever reason, they saw something in me and they were willing to spend their time and energy trying to help me get to wherever I was going to go. And so I wound up leaving the Philadelphia Police Department and going into academia. And my first job was amazing. It was at Clemson University, and I had a great experience there. And then this is where it becomes challenging. For people who don't know, in academia, we generally speaking don't get credit for books. Publishers in books really only care about whether they're going to get sued and whether they can make money. So in academia, we get credit for academic journal articles, which are peer reviewed, or books that are published by academic publishers. So I had to do that early on in my career for the sake of establishing my credibility. But the problem was, and my colleagues will tell you this, it's not as though this is a secret. The problem is no one outside of academia ever gets to see or hear our findings. And so when I started publishing mainstream books that were purposely designed for the mainstream audience, here again, I was lucky because there were people in my line of work, not all, of course, but many who were appreciative of the fact that I was trying to bridge the gap between academia and the public. And there's a field called public scholarship. I like to think that that's what I do. Because yes, I'll publish academic journal articles, but even my mainstream books, they're sourced to the teeth, no different than I would something that I would write for an academic journal article or whatever. So I've just been very lucky that people have been very kind and very generous, really, I mean, for all of my adult life.
Let's get into some of the writings. And this is why I asked the question, because your writings are spectacular. And I want to get into as many as we possibly can. Let's start in 2003 with Philadelphia's Black Mafia, a social and political history. Black Mafia, which has organized crime in predominantly African-American area dating back to the late 1960s. Sean, what were the alliances, but what also are the conspiracies of that?
Well, the main reason I got involved in that, ironically, was because the mentor I mentioned before, I didn't say him by name, but his name was Alan Block. He said, he knew that I knew people in Philadelphia Police Department. So he asked me as a favor, hey, can you do me a favor? And he was looking for two particular gangsters. One was named Jack Brown, and one was named Frank Moten. And they were black. That doesn't sound noteworthy in 2022. Trust me, in the 80s and 90s, that was a noteworthy thing. There was no such thing as black organized crime, at least to academia and to the media. Now, my goodness, you've got TV shows and movies called Black Gangster and all that. But so I reached out to my friends and colleagues in the Philadelphia Police Department, in the organized crime unit, and then in the intelligence unit, and asked them if they had anything on these two gangsters. And it's just an amazing story. they say, no, we don't have volumes of stuff. We do have like little, back then, this is funny for your older audience, they had the Dewey Decibel. So like they literally had the old card catalogs that you would see in a library. Well, that's how they had their files back then. This is before computers. And so they actually did have two little 3x5 cards, one on Jack Brown and one on Frank Moten, but that was pretty much it. And so one of the people I was talking to said, well, why are you doing this? And I said, oh, well, a friend of mine, a colleague, at Penn State, is researching African-American organized crime, but especially he's looking at drug trafficking along the Eastern Seaboard in the 60s and 70s. And the person I was talking to said, oh my goodness, well, if that's what you're doing, you need to talk about Philadelphia's Black Mafia. I'm born and raised in Philly, grew up in a cop family, voracious reader of news, and I never heard of that group. So like an idiot, of course, I go back to Penn State at a report. Hey, just so you know, they had stuff on Frank Moten and Jack Brown, not much, but they've got volumes. They have a whole room full of files on this group called Philadelphia's Black Mafia that was running the traffic all throughout the East Coast. And he said to me something so funny, and this will be a great example for your audience of what an idiot they're listening to. He says, well, obviously you're going to write about that. And I said, what are you talking about? I'm already, knee deep in Italian American organized crime. I was doing a little bit of stuff on Russians or whatever. And his argument was, look, man, how many people get access to a topic that most people don't know about, to a trove of research documents, primary source research documents that no one else even knows exists. And you can interview the people who were actually involved, because at the time, this is back in the late 80s, early 90s. So the people were alive, the people who were literally as part of the Black Mafia, people who worked the cases in the Philadelphia Police Department and the FBI and the U.S. Attorney's Office. You could do all that. And I fought him on this. And so the answer to your question is, with regard to the conspiracies, when I took on that project, for people who read that book, part of the whole project was, what are the differences between Black organized crime in Philly and Italian American organized crime in Philly? Were there alliances? Because the myth was always that disparate organized crime groups would fight with each other. That sounds sexy, and it's very simple for the public to think, well, of course, organized crime, group A is going to fight with organized. But that's not the case at all, because in the underworld, everybody knows you're going to get screwed over on a deal sooner or later, whether it's a drug deal or whatever. So you're constantly looking for ways to offset losses. And what I discovered, and I wrote about this in Philadelphia's Black Mafia, is that they not only were friendly, they were co-conspirators on a lot of deals. And that was for that reason. And to my point about the Black organized crime drug trafficking, don't forget, in the 60s and 70s, heroin is the drug of trade.
Right.
Well, at that moment in time, the main people doing that were people like Philadelphia's Black Mafia, where they were getting their shipments from Frank Matthews up in New York City. This isn't your question, but it bothers me that people know about Frank Lucas. That great movie with Denzel Washington about called American Gangster, was about Frank Lucas. I'm not saying that's factually inaccurate, but you talk to anybody who actually knows the story, and the main person we should be talking about is Frank Matthews. And the reason that we're talking about Frank Lucas and not Frank Matthews is because Frank Lucas got caught, became a federal informant. Frank Lucas fled the country and has never been heard or seen since. So, he's laughing somewhere with an umbrella in his drink as we're talking about Frank Lucas. So anyway, so there are all these alliances, and it was partly because if you were in any other ethnic or racial group of organized crime in the 60s and 70s, you actually needed access to Philly's Black Mafia for heroin. And with regard to their alliances, they not only dealt with each other with drugs, they dealt with each other with money laundering, all sorts of flim-flams. The only problem they had, and I write about this extensively in the book, there was this fateful incident in summer of 1973 where, for your audience who doesn't follow organized crime, obviously extortion is their main stock and trade, meaning that they go to people, typically illicit entrepreneurs, meaning people who can't go to law enforcement with their grievances. So they would target people like drug dealers, numbers runners, especially bars that allow gambling in their operation. And we're doing this in 2022. This is all when everything's illegal, of course.
Right.
Well, Philly's Black Mafia did not accept that they were restricted to their territory, which in Philadelphia meant west of Broad Street. Broad Street is essentially 14th Street in Philly. And the way it used to work was South Philly, which is essentially Broad to the river, was all, at the time it was Bruno family. And then the Black Mafia was supposed to stay west. Well, there became a fateful situation in the summer of 73 where the Black Mafia just started extorting numbers runners east of Broad Street. And that was supposed to be this major underground warfare because you're not supposed to do that. And in fact, there's a funny story in the book because one of the Italian mobsters goes to the Philadelphia Police Department and complains that the Black Mafia is encroaching on their territory. So anyways, it turns out nothing ever happened. There was no warfare. And the Italian guy, the Italian gangsters just conceded that particular, there were two numbers runners that they accepted that were going to be extorted now from the Philly Black Mafia. But the way the media portrays that, generally speaking, is, of course they're going to fight and they hate each other. Well, in that particular case and many others, it actually didn't turn out that way. And there was literally never any warfare. And in fact, I'm talking about the 70s, but if you flash forward to the 80s, and I talk about this in Philadelphia's Black Mafia also, there was a huge narcotics scandal in the Philadelphia and Pennsylvania prison systems. And it was orchestrated largely by Philly Black Mafia guys, but they were doing it in partnership with the Italian mobsters. So even through the 80s, this conspiracy was going on, and these guys were all buddies and friends. And so those are some of the myths. And by the way, when I took on that project, I really wasn't trying to disabuse anyone of myths. I was, honest to goodness, just trying to figure out what was happening. Mm-hmm. It just turns out that those were the myths, and I wound up just disabusing people of them.
Couple of things there on the explanation. The 1973 event, are you talking about the massacre of the adults and children in Washington, D.C.?
No. I'm just talking about in fact, Philadelphia Magazine had a big expose about this, and it had a Black Mafia superfly gangster on the cover with his back to a clearly overly ridiculous Italian mobster, both with guns drawn. And the argument was, and the title of Philadelphia Magazine was Philadelphia on the brink of underworld on the brink of war.
Got it.
That didn't happen. That's what I was referencing.
Okay.
Yeah. We can talk about the 1973 massacre if you like, sure.
The other thing I wanted to ask is, was the Black Mafia founded by Sam Christensen, who some people say was the most feared person in Philadelphia?
Yes, he was. Sam Christian was the most feared person in Philadelphia. And I tell this great anecdote in that book where he and his colleague, Ron Harvey, they love shooting craps. And at the time, shooting craps was a really big deal in Philadelphia, especially in Black Philadelphia. Well, they would go up to corners to shoot craps. And on occasion, people would just start handing over their money to Sam Christian. And they're like, no, we're here to play. We're not here, we're not here to take your money or rob you or anything like that. They were feared among people who were feared. No, he was no joke. But I will say this, though. I'm always very careful when I describe Sam Christian because people focus on the fact that I forget the number offhand, but it was 7 or 9 murders where he was the lead suspect, or even in some cases, homicide cleared the case, meaning they had identified him, but they realized no one's going to, testify against him. That's true, but he was also incredibly smart. And there's an entire section of that book where I talk about their white collar crimes, where they were doing all sorts of unbelievable federal frauds. Because at the time, don't forget, this is 60s and 70s. So there's a big push at the time to deal with what they call urban warfare and gangs especially. And so there's this entire push for what they called community development funds. And Philly's Black Mafia, led by Sam Christian, applied for the money and actually got federal grants. So you literally had federally funded gangsters who were murdering people and doing all sorts of things. So I never want to minimize him being just like this brutal, underground warrior. Yeah, that's true. People feared him, but he was also a genius. And people didn't understand it. When they were starting to get those federal money, the Black Mafia guys are literally taking pictures with city councilmen. They're taking pictures with the mayor. And then they're using those public exploits, and they're going to all the people in Black Philadelphia who are already being terrorized by these guys. And they're saying, you think you're going to go talk to the police? You think you're going to complain to the media or to the mayor's office? You saw me the other day with the mayor. You saw me with the city council member. They were exploiting this in ways the public never really understood. And so the poor people who are being extorted, robbed, and murdered by these guys are watching this on TV and they're going, how is anyone not paying attention to this? Is anyone going to listen to the fact that we're being victimized like crazy here?
Listeners, go to the show notes. I'm going to put links where you can get your hands on Sean's books, purchase them, read them. You'll thoroughly enjoy them. Before we move on to probably the biggest topic you've been talking about since the Netflix release, and we're going to get into gaming the game, let's bring our listeners up to speed on that 1973 massacre of the adults and 5 children in Washington, D.C.
Sure. Well, to my knowledge, it's still the largest mass murder in Washington, D.C. history. And the abbreviated version is that, for people who don't know, Philadelphia's Black Mafia was very closely aligned with the Nation of Islam's Temple 12 in Philadelphia. Nation of Islam at the time, headed by Elijah Muhammad. In Philadelphia, the head of Temple 12, and again, you could do this for hours. Every mosque around the country, there were 52 mosques. Every one of them was numbered. Philadelphia was number 12. It was headed by a guy named Jeremiah Shabazz. Some call him the godfather of Philadelphia's Black Mafia. Regardless, members of Philadelphia's Black Mafia were all totally embedded, the leadership especially, were totally embedded in Temple 12. So much so that their hierarchy made up the fruit of Islam for Temple 12. Again, for your listeners, the fruit of Islam was the paramilitary faction of the Nation of Islam. They would do things like protect the mosque, protect the minister, do security checks, background checks, all that sort of stuff for the mosque. Well, in Philadelphia's case, those were all Black Mafia murderers, heavies. Well, anyway, a person named Ernest McGee, who became Hamas Abdul Khalis when he joined the nation, he was a high-ranking official in the Nation of Islam. I mean, closely affiliated with Elijah Muhammad. He came to a point where he did not like the way the nation was going. And his argument, it was too political. It wasn't based on true Islam. It wasn't religious enough for him. He splits from the sect. He starts his own sect of Islam called Hanafi Islam, based on Abu Hanifa. He moves to Washington, D.C. His home is purchased for him by Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, who at the time was Lou Alcindor. Just like the Nation of Islam had its biggest convert in Muhammad Ali, who was Cassius Clay until he became a member of the nation. He became, Cassius Clay. Well, here we go again. Ernest McGee becomes Ernest X with the nation and then becomes Hamas Abdul Khalis. When Kareem Abdul-Jabbar buys the house for him in D.C., Hamas Abdul Khalis is living there with his family, and he sends a letter out to all the mosques of the Nation of Islam all around the country. And it's just ripping into Elijah Muhammad. The Nation of Islam calls Elijah Muhammad a false prophet, and a lot of other things. Well, that letter, of course, gets to all the guys in Philly's Black Mafia. And I describe this in both of my books on Philly's Black Mafia, where the debate has always been who gave the order. Well, someone gives the order for Philadelphia's Black Mafia to send a hit squad down to Washington, D.C. to kill Hamas Abdul Khalis. So 8 Black Mafia members go down to Washington, D.C. from Philly. But by the way, this should also show your audience how serious these people were. They went down first on a scouting mission to assess the house, where it sat, how they could go in and out. This is not flippant. Well, they ultimately go down there. Hamas Abdul Khalis is not home. They murder a bunch of people in the home, including a bunch of little kids, including a 9-day-old baby, and flee. This becomes a huge national story. Obviously, you can't commit the largest mass murder in D.C. history and not make news. Well, you can go back and look at all of the media coverage nationally, especially obviously in the Washington Post, because it's the local story for them, Philadelphia Inquirer, Philadelphia Daily News, Philadelphia Bulletin. You won't see a single mention of anything called Philadelphia's Black Mafia. You'll see discussions about the Nation of Islam fighting with the Hanafi Muslims, but no one's realizing at that point in time that there's this group calling itself Philly's Black Mafia that's been around for a while. And that's partly because the media ignored it, but it was also because law enforcement was trained starting in the 60s. And again, I get into this in my books too, to look at organized crime as an Italian-American phenomenon. Mm-hmm. The whole concept of African organized crime, that wasn't on their radar screen. In fact, I have a great quote in there from a New York Police Department organized crime guy. He said it just wasn't on our radar screen. Well, that was true in Philly too. In Philly, it was actually the organized crime unit was originally called Intercept, which was short for the internal the internal security against the emerging Italian threat. That's literally what they thought. They thought there were these Italian immigrants who were trying to subvert the American system. So no one covered that case as a Black Mafia case when it happened in 1973. And so when I talk about this nowadays, people go, oh, wow, that's a crazy story. Well, you have to understand, back in 1973, it was not just a crazy story. People were living in fear all throughout the East Coast because people in Black neighborhoods knew what this was because they all knew the street legend, and they didn't need to know the details. But if somebody visited them and said, hey, look, Philly's Black Mafia is taking over this corner, or Philadelphia's Black Mafia has that territory, they knew to bow. And some of the great, I cite this all the time in my books, I had almost unfettered access to everything. Not just the stuff that I write about is not redacted. It's all unredacted. It's raw intelligence. Well, they interviewed a lot of criminals back then. And the criminals were talking about how fearful they were of Philly's Black Mafia because they were just crazy. And there's actually a list in Philadelphia's Black Mafia of the dozens of people they murdered in a very short span of time. But for the fact that they got greedy, and when I say that got greedy, instead of just taking a percentage of drug profits by extorting the drug dealers, well, they thought, well, heck, we can just take over the whole drug trade. Well, that's a mistake, because now you can be on drug wiretaps, and it doesn't matter what a bad MFer you are. You're on the wiretaps extorting somebody, and you're going to go away to prison for a long time. You can no longer threaten witnesses. Mm-hmm. But other than that, but for them making that mistake, if people read my books, they'll realize, oh my goodness, these guys actually did not wind up getting convicted, let alone sentenced for the murders. We talked about Sam Christian earlier. Sam Christian never served a day in prison for any of the murders. None. He made the mistake of shooting a New York City police officer in a robbery in, whatever year it was, I forget. But so if he hadn't made that mistake, he never would have served a day in prison. That's what people don't get. If you're this sort of gangster, this is more true years ago before cell phones and videos, obviously. Part of the way that you succeeded was by committing public acts of violence. That wasn't by mistake. The public thinks, oh, that's really stupid. No, if you're trying to send a message to your extortion targets, you purposely kill people in public, whether it's the mass murder you talked about in 73 or the 1972 Fat Ty Palmer killing at the Club Harlem in Atlantic City, where they murdered a handful of people in front of 800 people at a nightclub. They did that on purpose. And by the way, no one was convicted of that either.
Is the Black Mafia or the Italian Mafia more feared?
If you had asked me that question and I was doing this back in 1973 or 4, it wouldn't even have been a doubt. It was definitely the Philly's Black Mafia was, just crazy. And that ended there. I argue they ended in roughly 1984, 1985. There were two big prosecutions. One was 74, and then the other one was 84, 85. But here's the thing. This doesn't really answer your question. I would say Philly's Black Mafia back then. What the public needs to know is the reason that you haven't heard about Philly's Black Mafia, and in Philadelphia's case, you don't even hear about Italian gangsters nowadays. By the time you get to mid to late 80s, federal law enforcement has all these tools that they only started getting in the 1970s. And by the 80s, they figured them out. So we all talk about witness immunity, witness protection, wiretapping, as if it's like standard fare. Well, that only started happening starting in 68, and then it starts really happening in the early 70s. The feds start figuring that out in the late 70s, and now it's sort of a cookie cutter approach. Back then, it wasn't true. So the reason that we no longer talk about organized crime the way we did, like I say, going back to the mid 80s, it's because they pretty much snuffed it out all over the country. Nowadays, it's so easy to prosecute organized crime. I also get a kick out of people who say, oh, well, this generation of mobsters is ridiculous. They rat on everybody. Well, the last two generations of mobsters weren't being presented with their voices and faces on video. Correct. Over and over again, no brainer, what was happening. So yeah, it was a lot easier to keep your mouth shut because you could make a good argument. They don't have anything. If we kill the witnesses or scare the witnesses, the feds have nothing. Well, that was true.
This is true. According to a recent CBS News poll, 54% of American families are affected by cancer. My story will touch you on how I survived colon and liver cancer. Now, I'm living a healthy lifestyle. I will inspire you to inspire others. Allow me to not only entertain, but leave you energized and driven to change your life and bring your organization working closer together. So open those minds and let me provide the tools to gain your greatest level of personal enrichment. For more information, go to TommyCanale.com. That's TommyCanale.com. And remember, you're one day away from changing your life. Click the link in the show notes. 2011, the bestseller, Gaming the Game, the story behind the NBA betting scandal and the gambler who made it happen. The NBA referee, Tim Donaghy. Let's start here. How did Tim get reconnected with Jimmy Batista and Tommy Martino? Because didn't they all three go to high school together?
Yes. Tim Donaghy, the referee, Jimmy Batista, the pro gambler, and Tommy Martino, their mutual friend, all went to high school together. They went to Cardinal O'Hara High School in the suburbs of Philadelphia together. Tim Donaghy became a referee. By the time you get forward to 2007, when the scandal happened, he's been a nine-year NBA referee. He's unaware that Jimmy Batista, they know each other, but they're not friends.
Okay.
But because of Martino is best friends with Donaghy, and he's very good friends with Batista. So these three parties are all aware of each other throughout all their adult life, from high school straight through we get to the NBA scandal. Well, when you get to 2003, Donaghy starts betting on games he's officiating. He bets with a friend of his named Jack Kincannon. Jack Kincannon is not a mobster. He's not a pro gambler. He's a regular guy. Well, Tim Donaghy didn't know until Gaming the Game came out in 2011. Well, what was Jack Kincannon doing with the bets that I was giving him on games I was officiating? Well, he was betting them with a professional gambler named Pete Ruggieri. Pete Ruggieri realizes very early on, oh my goodness, Jack is just like Tommy and just like Sean. He's just a regular gambler. He doesn't usually win that much. He doesn't bet that much. He's a regular schmo. But for some reason, starting in 2003, he starts betting $5,000 on certain games, and those games are winning at 78%. So he, of course, says, well, what is noteworthy? What is the theme? What is the pattern to these $5,000? And, of course, they were games officiated by Tim Donaghy. And so Pete Ruggieri and people like Jimmy Batista start copying the bets that Donaghy is placing with Jack Kincannon. Donaghy is totally unaware of this. Well, until 2011 when Gaming the Game came out. So from 2003 to 2006, so it's 3 NBA seasons, the pro gamblers are copying the bets that Donaghy is placing with Jack Kincannon. You flash forward to November of 2006. Tim Donaghy starts complaining to Tommy Martino that Jack Kincannon is losing money betting down Atlantic City, and he's not paying me all my winners. And he's upset. He wants to bet with somebody else. Well, Tommy Martino is constantly in contact with Jimmy Batista. And Batista says, well, hey, let him bet with me. He doesn't tell him, hey, just so you know, I've been copying those bets for the last 3 years. He just says, hey, well, have him bet with me. And so they scheduled this infamous meeting at the Philadelphia International Marriott in December of 2006. I think it's December 12th, for whatever reason. And they have this meeting. And the deal is Batista says, hey, look, 2 things. First of all, if we're going to do this, I only want you giving the information to me. I don't want Jack Kincannon involved in this at all. By the way, Jimmy knew Jack too. This is a crowd from that area. You know, it's no big deal. Well, anyway, so he says, I don't want Jack Kincannon involved at all. It's got to be just through me. And you have to get the picks earlier because I'm going to manipulate worldwide betting lines. And the earlier, the better for me to actually play those lines. And I know for your audience that doesn't know gambling, trust me, I didn't do this before I took on the Gaming the Game project either. The way that these people make their really good money is if a team is favored by X number of points, 3 points for argument's sake, and they know which side is more likely to win, they're going to try and move that line depending on where the line is. So if they want it to 6 points, they can bet strategically around the world because of partly how much money they're betting, but also betting patterns. They know the algorithms and the way the sports books work. They'll bet on one side of the proposition at one point and then purposely manipulate the worldwide betting market for as long as they can. And then the next day, they're going to bet as much on the other side as they can. That's the way they make their money. It's sort of an investment to bring back a big return, but it's only happening in a span of 24 hours. So those are the two conditions that they cut the deal. So the answer to your question is they hadn't actually met physically. I think the last time that Donaghy and Batista had been in each other's presence was Tommy Martino's wedding. Otherwise, they kept clear of each other. First of all, they weren't friends. But secondly, they knew Tim Donaghy didn't want to be in the presence of a professional gambler, and Batista didn't want to be in the presence of a referee, especially starting in 2003 when he knew what was going on. They were smart enough to do that. So that's the answer to your question.
Who was the FBI target then? Was it Donaghy? Was it Batista? Who was the FBI target?
Oh, my goodness. You're the first person to ask that question. It's a great question. At that moment in time, the target is Tim Donaghy, but it's especially Jimmy Batista. And the reason I say it's a great question is because the public has assumed all these years. I mean, this all starts happening in 2007. It hits the media in 2009. People have thought ever since then that the target was Tim Donaghy. It wasn't. Because once they realized what was happening and they started looking into Jimmy Batista, they realized what he was doing, because they not only had access to Batista, they're looking at the phone logs of a handful of professional gamblers. Again, Tommy, you and I are having this conversation in September of 2022. It's outrageous, and it's media malpractice that most of the public doesn't know the names of the FBI agents who worked the case, and they don't know the names of the professional gamblers who are betting on this. And the reason I bring that up is because with regard to this ridiculousness that Donaghy was the target, the reason that Batista was the target was because once they got access to the phone logs of the pro gamblers, they realized, holy smokes, these guys are betting millions of dollars offshore, which is blatantly illegal. Never mind the worry about fixing games. They're betting offshore, which is illegal, and especially there's tax evasion and money laundering. How are they bringing millions of dollars onshore every day? The feds found that mind-boggling, and they thought that Batista was going to be the key to pick that lock. That if they could get him on the NBA scandal and flip him, they could care less about this nuisance white-collar gambling thing. They're thinking, man, we can explore this entire offshore sportsbook money laundering thing. Because, yeah, we're talking about the NBA betting scandal, but if you're an FBI agent, you're thinking, wait a second, drug dealers, terrorists, anybody can put money in an offshore sportsbook account, theoretically, to quote-unquote bet, but then just get the money paid off in the United States, and you've successfully laundered millions of dollars.
Was Batista connected to the Gambino crime family?
Well, this is where I get in arguments with people all the time. It depends on how you define connected.
Okay.
I argue he wasn't. The pro gamblers have what are called outs. And what I mean by that is, I mentioned earlier that if you're a professional gambler, you need to manipulate betting lines. And the way you do that is strategically. No sports book is going to take a $1 million bet or a $2 million bet. Most, especially like in Vegas, they'll cap you at $5,000, $10,000, whatever. Maybe not some schmo tourist, but for a pro gambler, they're not giving you big action. The big action's offshore, but even there, they're going to cap you. They're not going to let you bet that kind of money, because their argument is, wait, what do you know that I don't? And the other thing is they have to then offset your major bet with money on the other side. Otherwise, they're putting themselves into a box for a big loss. So people like Batista, their stock and trade was, they're going to find in a span of minutes. This is the skill. You have to do this really fast because all the betting lines are done by computers. So they're all changing minute to minute, second to second. So his gift, his skill was getting 5, 10 here, 20 there, 50 there, $100,000 there, all around the world as quickly as possible. Well, and they're called outs. He had dozens of outs all around the country, all around the world, that he could get done at a drop of a hat. And get that. So, I mean, again, for your audience, if the line is 3 and it moves to 4, well, that's not what they wanted, and they've lost their edge. It literally is that sophisticated. So it has to happen quickly before the computer algorithms adjust to this. Well, one of his outs was a Jewish bookmaker in Brooklyn, up in New York. That's the person that everyone keeps focusing on because yes, that guy had ties to the Gambino crime family,
Okay.
which is how this whole thing got discovered. When we say that the FBI discovered the NBA betting scandal because of a Gambino wiretap, that's what we're talking about.
Okay.
We're talking about a Jewish bookmaker who was one of the people moving the lines for the people in New York. So when Batista is parking money or moving money for this Jewish bookmaker, again, this is one of like dozens of people. I mean, to me, it's trivia because he's moving pennies compared to the worldwide market. I'm focused on the people who are literally dictating the betting around the world. But because it's not a mobster, people go, oh, we don't care about those pro gamblers. Yeah, who cares that they're the ones actually dictating the worldwide market? But somebody's got an Italian surname on a wiretap in New York, so we're going to focus on that. That's how we got in this mess.
Back to Donaghy. How long did he stay under the radar? And has, in your research, has anything been done to try and prevent this from happening again? Because I'm sure there's people out there going, maybe there's another referee in another sport doing this.
Well, first part of your question, he was under the radar he was under the radar the whole time. That the NBA betting scandal didn't stop because the NBA stopped it or because the FBI stopped it. It stopped because the pro gambler, Pete Ruggieri, in April of 2000. Oh, this is actually important. You didn't ask this question, but just so you know, Batista goes into drug rehab on March 18, 2007. Donaghy has said for more than a decade now that that's when he stopped betting because he was relieved of organized crime. The mobsters were no longer threatening him to keep betting. Well, the truth was that the scandal just shifted. Batista goes in drug rehab. Pete Ruggieri now takes over the scheme. And he bets until however many, there's a debate on how many games, but until early April. And Ruggieri shuts the scheme down. And he shuts the scheme down because the betting lines are moving too much. He can no longer do what I just described to your audience a few minutes ago. He can't control the lines, which is how they make their money. The word out on the street is that Donaghy's fixing games to just copy the betting lines. So he shuts the scheme down. To your point, however, and by the way, Donaghy denies everything I just said, even though that's what all of his co-conspirators say. It's what the betting lines say. And his plea agreement goes through April, not through March. I'll fight that until the death. But anyway, the answer to your question, Tommy, is that no one discovered this from 03 to 07. I don't blame the NBA for not picking up on this from 03 to 06. But in 06, 07, because Batista is now getting those picks early and the lines are moving way more. I described this in the appendix of Game in the Game. The lines are moving way differently in 06, 07 than they were from 03 to 06. That's when I think the NBA should have learned. And they say they didn't. I don't know how that's possible because I spoke with sportsbook managers and they picked up on it because they're just looking at the lines. They don't know the nuances of who's doing what. They're just looking at that. They're just looking at the data, and the data are what the data say. So anyway, so they say they didn't discover it. So with regard to whether they can figure it out today, which is the second part of your question, I always say I don't know because I don't have confidence in that. When the NBA conducted their study, it's the Pedowitz study. Larry Pedowitz was a lawyer in New York, and he was hired to do a study researching the scandal. The problem was when he did his research, he didn't have access to the three co-conspirators, Donaghy, the referee, Batista, the gambler, Martina, the mutual friend. The FBI wouldn't share their files. The FBI agents were not allowed to talk to him. So what could he say? So their research was scant at best back then. And they said that as a result of this, that they were going to start monitoring betting lines. Well, look, we hope that's true, but there's no evidence of that. And even that, if true, would not have picked up necessarily what Donaghy was doing. It would have picked up betting line oddities. But if an official wanted to call technically correct calls early in games, to make sure that their betting proposition would win at the end of the games, when people are looking for bad calls at the end of games, well, you wouldn't pick up on that.
Right.
So we're trusting the NBA that they're now monitoring this. Now, the good thing is with legalized sports gambling, we've never had more data being collected. We've never had more eyes on the games, whether it's NBA or anything else. So hopefully it's less likely, but I don't know.
There's some, I don't know what you want to call a cloud that we need to clear up. Donaghy has said that he was extorted by the Gambino crime family, but the public record states that he was a willing participant. Is that not true?
It says more than that, actually. Yeah, the federal government, when they during his plea agreement, said that Donaghy, and the quote is, he was never more, they say in their plea agreement that he said himself, Donaghy was never more than a willing participant. The judge who sentenced Donaghy said that he was actually, quote unquote, more culpable than his co-conspirators. And as I've said repeatedly, Donaghy goes on TV, he's on this Netflix special saying he was extorted. Well, no one was ever charged with extortion. He talks about the mob because it deflects attention away from him and it's sexy and it sells. But the FBI agents in New York, in any of their press releases, in any of their court filings, never even mention organized crime. The U.S. Attorney's Office never mentions organized crime. And in fact, that infamous meeting, which Donaghy again says on that Netflix special, which is where he talks about the mob in December of 2006, that meeting at the International Marriott that I mentioned before. Well, the feds call that they actually say in their pleadings that was arranged, that the parties knew this was happening and they scheduled a meeting. And so the only reason we're talking about this in 2022 is because the media has allowed Tim Donaghy to say it for the last 13 years. The feds never said it. The U.S. Attorney's Office never said it. The judge never said it. I certainly never said it. And that's it. Look, I'm an organized crime scholar. It's what I do for a living. That's why I took on this project back in 2008. I heard there was maybe an organized crime angle. And I figured, okay, well, no one's really ever researched the underworld of organized crime. In my line of work, and you probably know this, Tommy, generally speaking, we focus on like local bookmakers at your local tap room or bar or whatever. You're not doing like multi-million dollar gamblers who are betting every day. That was why I took on the project. But I realized early on, oh, that's not what this is. And that actually matters. And I say this in Game in the Game. Part of the reason the FBI looked at this case as a nuisance was because they realized early on, oh, we're organized crime squad based in Brooklyn, and we're traveling 2 hours down to Philly all the time to research this white collar gambling case. What a nuisance. They realized early on what was going on. And I quote them extensively in the book about this. And yet, I don't know what percentage, but a big percentage of the public still thinks the mob made Tim Donaghy bet in 2006 and 2007. I mean, it's not even close to that.
Listeners, go to the show notes, click the link, go buy 2 copies of Gaming the Game, one for yourself and one to give away because Christmas is coming. So you just bought a Christmas gift. Sean's not going to care if you buy 2. Trust me, you can buy more than that if you'd like. I want to shift gears and conclude the interview with this. You've conducted research in the Netherlands for many summers on international trade of women and vice laws. How eye-opening has this been for you?
Oh my goodness. Well, that was a lot of times, by the way. I don't know what the number was. I think it was 9 summers, 5 weeks every summer. It was great. Very eye-opening. One thing is, though, we in the United States we take the lessons from the Netherlands and try and apply them here. And it's not wise to do that. There are a lot of things different. We're discovering it now when we're trying to legalize marijuana. Well, if you talk to the Dutch, they've always made this big distinction between decriminalizing something and legalizing it. There's a huge difference there.
Yes.
Because if you decriminalize something, yeah, you can tolerate it in a red light district. But if you want to try and do that in a regular residential area where you're going to have a problem, there's a huge difference there. And the other thing, too, is their mores are different. They rely, this is my criminology coming out. They rely far more on informal social control than they do social control, meaning they rely more on culture, churches, religious institutions, your neighborhood, your family. Their argument is you shouldn't need a formal social control, the criminal justice system, to dictate your livelihood. So if you look at usage rates, well, ironically, even though for decades you could get marijuana and hash in the Netherlands, our usage rates were higher, even though it was ubiquitous overseas. And so we keep trying to take their model and apply it here. And I'm very careful because of my line of work. I don't take positions on any of these things publicly. I never even took a position on legalization of sports gambling, even though I wrote the book on Game in the Game on legalization and the whole issue of the NBA betting scandal. But if you're going to do that, you have to be wise. So when there was this great article in the LA Times about 2 weeks ago. So this was like, I don't know, early September, which said that the legalization of marijuana in California was sold on false premises. And their argument was that everyone was told that organized crime and gangs would be lessened if you legalized marijuana distribution. Well, that I've said for years, that's naive and ignorant. And you don't even need my experience in the Netherlands. And by the way, I'm a piker compared to other people. Other people do this for a living, but you don't need the actual hand on your stove getting burned. Oh, that's hot. Just do the math. It's the economy. If you tax something and regulate it, by definition, you have created a black market because someone is going to try and provide that product for cheaper. Whether it's as good or not, it's a separate issue. And that's what's happening with marijuana. You didn't need the experience in Holland to tell you that. Because even though Holland decriminalized marijuana, I mean, my goodness, 50 years ago, you could go to Amsterdam or wherever, you'd literally get out of a train station and immediately be besieged by people trying to sell you drugs. And you go, wait, I thought it was legal here. Yeah, but of course there's an underground economy. And so I never understood that argument. I've been in academic conferences for 30 years now trying to make that argument. But people, for some reason, have this idea that if you legalize a vice, that it takes care of the underground market. Well, that's not true with narcotics. It's not true with gambling, which is one of the things I try explaining in Game in the Game. Because, yeah, your sports book is now legal and you can bet legally. But you know what? They're going to want you to pay when you lose. Well, the local bookmaker will let you bet on credit. Well, try that at MGM or the Sands. You know what I mean? So people are just not thinking through this stuff. Yeah, this is serious business.
How can listeners connect with you?
Thank you for asking. Obviously, I obviously love that you promote Game in the Game and Philadelphia's Black Mafia, and I had a mainstream version of that, which is Black Brothers Incorporated. That's the one, by the way, that was made into a documentary on Black Entertainment Television. Their second season was great. It was called Philly Black Mafia Do for Self. It's online. But they can find me on my website, which is SeanPatrickGriffin.net. Sean is spelled S-E-A-N, and Griffin is G-R-I-F-F-I-N. SeanPatrickGriffin.net. And by the way, part of the thing when I made my website, I never wanted to be accused of being a grifter. So instead of selling my books on Twitter or anywhere else, I send people to my website because for the most part, you can find all the data and all the analyses to debunk a lot of the myths, whether it's about organized crime or, of course, lately it's about the NBA betting scandal. You can find all that on my website. I was sick and tired of having all these arguments. So I put as much stuff on my website as I could. And on Twitter, you can find me at SPG Author.
I will put links in the show notes to all of those folks so you can just go click on those and get connected with Sean. Sean, thanks so much for your time and coming on and talking. I mean, we only really scratched the surface on a lot of things. I wanted to get as much as I could out to my listeners, but I've enjoyed it.
It's been great.
You are welcome. Listeners, follow me on Instagram at Before the Lights Podcast. And if you'd like to become a member of the BTL members group, go to the show notes again, click the link that says join the BTL members group right there. And you can become part of the exclusive Before the Lights members, and we meet every single month. Thank you for listening to Before the Lights. I'm Tommy Canale. And until next time, everybody, I salute a chin chin.